Hello and welcome to the Broken Rails 1121st New Social Environment. I'm Min, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Enrique Martínez Celaya and Jessica Holmes. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Enrique Martínez Celaya is an artist, author, and former scientist whose work spans painting, sculpture, installation, fiction, philosophy, and poetry. His notable projects include the Phillips Collection, the State Hermitage Museum, St. Petersburg, the Berliner Philharmonie, and the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes, Havana. His work is in the collection of over 60 leading international museums, and he has authored 9 books on art, philosophy, and poetry. He is the first Provost Professor of Humanities and Arts in the history of University of Southern California. He is represented by Gallery Wendi Norris in San Francisco, where the wilderness is currently on view. And our host today, writer, editor, and critic Jessica Holmes' writing features regularly in Bomb, Hyperallergic, and The Broken Rail, where she also edits the Art Tonic column. Other bylines include Vanity Fair Spain, the magazine Antiques, and the Woman's Art Journal. Previously, she served as editor-in-chief of the arts publication Degree Critical. For nearly 2 decades, she worked for the Calder Foundation, including 6 years as its deputy director. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Jess, to get us started.
Thank you, Min. Thank you for having Enrique and I here today. Enrique, thanks for being here. And thank you to everyone who has signed on. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I'm really looking forward to talking with Enrique about your show, The Wilderness. Before we really get going, Enrique, and jumping into the present exhibition, I thought maybe it would be nice if you could foreground this with a little bit of your background and especially your unique trajectory to becoming an artist for people out there who are perhaps new to your work for the first time today.
Thank you. Well, thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you, Jess. I will maybe just say biographically, I was born in Cuba, left when I was 7, moved to Spain and Puerto Rico, and came to America for college. I started as an apprentice for a painter in my teens. I was interested in trying to understand life better. It's the same reason that I read philosophy and make paintings at that time. And then I went to college to do physics for more or less the same reason. I wanted to make sense of the world. And also as an immigrant, first son, it didn't make sense to be an artist. And I didn't even think it was a possibility. And when I was doing my graduate school in physics, I applied for the MFA. I did both of them at the same time. Left and worked as a scientist for a bit and trying to get my art career to go somewhere. So that's kind of a background that explains why my interests are wide-ranging and why I don't see a great separation between art, philosophy, and science, at least as inquiries. They're different things, but I see them all as inquiries into meaning and into life. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, and I appreciate that just for everybody out there. Your present show at Wendi Norris is called The Wilderness, a title which I find both, physically and metaphorically evocative. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit how you landed on that as an overarching idea for this body of work.
This was an important body of work for me because there are many, many things that appear new here and certain transitions that are happening here as well. And I was interested in this wilderness that exists both outside of ourselves, the idea of the wilderness being something we want to explore, inviting exploration, an invitation to discover something you don't know that is somewhat untouched, somewhat unknown, but also the internal wilderness. To a large extent, I feel that there's still so much unknown within ourselves, not only in the unconscious, but in deeper understandings of reality within ourselves. So the idea of the wilderness here is a dual wilderness, the external wilderness and the internal wilderness, and they come together in the sort of the membrane of the self or the skin of the body.
I know that in these works you sort of have a new idea or a newer idea that's developed, which is the idea of the painter is really become front and center. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of these paintings?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. When I was younger, and I remember looking at Picasso's, the late Picasso's concern with the painter, and I remember him drawing the painter as a monkey and the painter as all these things, and I seen since many painters painting themselves, of course, Velázquez in Las Meninas and everyone else, and I never really understood the idea of why. Let me correct myself. I understood the idea of why doing it. It just never felt the impulse to do it myself. And maybe it's age, maybe it's something that comes um, with asking, what is it that I'm really doing? There's something about being an artist in general, not just a painter, but a painter in particular, that 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 is embracing too much, is trying to put your arms around something that you cannot put your arms around, that is too big for you. And in some ways, as the more you do it, and the more you attempt to do this overreaching, the more you realize both the beauty of it and the futility of it. And there is um, it's a lot of awareness that comes with that constant reaching that becomes a source of a lot of reflection about how valuable it is, how meaningful or meaningless it is. And you know those beautiful Rembrandt self-portraits that you can see the young Rembrandt painting himself with such elegance and such bravado and arrogance. And then you watch this beautiful evolution of Rembrandt as he ages and doubts creep in, and an awareness of the accumulation of a life lived into his eyes and to his expression. And in some ways, the young painter that thought he could do everything becomes a figure aware of his own limitations and perhaps failures. So this is how the painter appears for me. And this particular image that is up on the screen right now, where a painter is pushed against the curtain. And I think the curtain there's an aspect of showmanship and performance to being an artist in the world, where everything is always exposed, everything is revealed. And that aspect of the curtain that hides something and suggests that there will be some revelation to come at some point. And in a curtain like this, for instance, which I painted and repainted more realistic, less realistic, and at the end up being the painter shoved against that curtain. And his palette, the only element of strong color here, also shoved against another corner. So all you're left really is with this star gaze of the painter being looked at, being witnessed. And I think it's an examination of a certain impulse that at times feels beautiful and at times feels um, terrifying
Hmm.
to be a painter.
Enrique, I'm glad you brought up the difference in tones in this particular painting with the vibrant palette and then the artist rendered almost in a gray scale. Um, Across the few paintings in the show where the painter is rendered, the colors are much more muted and in a couple of cases almost gray, as opposed to the other canvases, which have very rich and vibrant tones. Was that a conscious decision, or how did you come to this use of color for that particular subject?
So that's another good question, and let me answer it by going around it a bit.
Mhm,
Um, so let me first say that all the paintings that I make that survive
mhm,
are paintings where strategies and my understanding of them um, doesn't that the paintings that survive are paintings that I don't fully understand how they work.
mhm,
So, like, whenever I understand why painting works, and the older I get, because I've been painting for a long time, the more I understand why they work, I immediately destroy them and paint them over. So the paintings that survive are paintings that, in some manner or another, elude my apprehension, my understanding, my theorizing. So when the question you asked me, um, the reason I'm beginning to answer like that is by first sort of acknowledging my uh, acknowledging my humility about what I know about this painting. So yes, I see what you mean, and there are many choices here. I kept removing color out of this painting in particular, and all the paintings that are painters up here. And I think part of it is an attempt to remove the spectacle out of the painting, because by this, in the very nature that you're presenting a painter, a painter presenting a painter, there is something already so outrageous about that,
mhm.
that the removal of any ornamental quality seem appropriate. And yet, at the end, the reason why these paintings look the way they look is operating a little bit beyond me.
You're alluding a little bit to your process of going to the canvas and making a painting. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? How much of it is intuitive? How much do you think beforehand? And perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how you actually go about attacking the surface.
Yeah. I I write at the same time that I paint. So I go back and forth between writings and paintings and writings for clarification, not of the content of the painting, but the state of being in which I find myself going to the paintings. Um, and I try not to do sketches or any preliminary studies. I want to discover what is going to be unfold in this state of being. I know that saying something is a state of being is very vague, but in some ways it has a great sense of precision in the actual experience. When I stand in front of the painting, I there's a certain emotional register that begins the painting. And then I paint it over and paint it over again and destroy it and sometimes strip them, sometimes scrape them. And what I am after is very similar to what my experience was as a scientist. As a scientist, you come into the laboratory with a lot of knowledge,
Mhm.
but the only reason that you're in the laboratory is to find out what you don't know. I mean, you don't go to the lab and make an experiment to show yourself what you already know. So a scientist is always operating in the edge of the known, moving towards the unknown, in an inquiry to understand something better. So even though you rely so deeply in what you have learned and what you know, there is an edge of there are many leaps and intuitions and other processes that you need to do in the process of discovery. So in my work is the same way. I'm never trying to impart my paintings with a lesson or a wisdom or show how much I know about anything, but rather quite the opposite. I'm trying to make sure that what I know is only to take me to the edge of of the known and see what else can unfold, what other truth-like experience can happen. And related to that, I think that the role of intelligence is to move itself out of the way, to help you move and make fine distinctions, but not to become end in themselves. So the idea is that the painting in the process, whenever I see something that I'm trying to show off or trying to be too clever, I destroy it because I always think that gets in the way of something like truth.
You just touched on this very briefly a minute ago, and also it was something that you mentioned when we were talking the other day was the edges of the paintings and the borders. It was almost an offhand comment the other day, but after that, I went back and I studied the paintings, and there really is like a definite importance to how you are bordering these works. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about the edges, the borders. And Min, I thought maybe we could put up slide number 5 as we talk because the lovely one in particular has a very distinctive edge.
Yeah, I mean, like I would love to just spend 3 hours talking about this because it's something exciting to me, and I have been struggling with it since I was very young. So, there's a painting exists in a tension between edges and center, and most of what people talk about paintings and uh, theory of paintings, or like somebody like Walheim or someone like that talking about paintings, we always tend to address what's inside, whether it's a non-figurative painting or a figurative painting. We tend to look at the bulk of it. But at the end of the day, to me, painting as a noun versus painting as a verb um, depends on how it is conceived as an object. And an object, I mean here an object of apprehension, an object of the mind versus a physical object. And that depends on what the edges tell you that it is. So if the edges tell you that it is something frame, and let me see, if I am not clear, please tell me that I'm not being clear. So if we have something that suggests that the world continues between that edge, beyond that edge, and what you're looking at is just a small frame, that's a very particular position about the experience that you're looking at. You're actually zooming into a particular part of a larger world. But if the edges tell you that there's no other world, like for example, in a Malevich painting, the Malevich painting exists only in the world of the painting. And that's a very entirely different position. So for example, the Malevich painting is a different position that a Kandinsky painting or a Hilma Klint painting. And to a large extent, the reason why they're different is because the way the edges are considered. They tell you there are different things in the world and there are different worlds. So for me, who I'm a figurative painter, I hate that term, but I use these references in my work. I am interested in fragments of reality, in fragmentary poems, in fragments of poems that have a charge, a certain energy, a certain discontinuity. that makes them resonant. And in order for that, I need to kind of constantly work with these edges to say, well, this is not just a vista of the world. This is not just a little view into a deer, but this is an entire construction that doesn't exist. This is not a deer. This is a painting, and this is a fragment also of a certain experiential relationship to you being standing there looking at this. And the best way to do that is to alert to what happened to the edges. There's also some revelation of the history of the making by the edges. And in this painting in particular, by putting those little flowers on the right-hand side, those flowers exist in an entirely different register as the gray background in which the deer exists. So this is bringing two different registers together about what a painting is. So those little flowers also then render that deer image into like will be an ex voto or some retablo in traditional devoted kind of paintings. And then it makes you think of this as not really an image at all, but a fragment of something you found, maybe discarded in your memory. Sorry to have gone on and on about it.
No. Don't apologize. That is, it's very poetic what you're saying, and it resonates with some of the writing of yours that I was reading over the weekend. I guess I'm wondering how your writing informs your practice and how your artistic practice maybe also informs your writing, or do they exist in separate realms?
They do exist in separate realms from the point of view that I never bring them together into a space. So I'm not a writer, even though I write in my paintings occasionally. I don't usually exhibit them together, my writings and my paintings, or include my paintings in my writings. But for many years now, my biggest influences have been writers, particularly poets. And not so much for the content or the imagery, but for a certain texture, emotional pressure. So for example, if I think of Czesław Miłosz or Thomas Tranströmer, there's a certain pressure to those images and the relationship between them that I find to be very provoking and I am interested in what's happening with that. Also, when I was younger, I was very influenced by the Latin American boom and the painters that came in Latin America in the 50s and 60s. And one of the reasons I was interested in them is because they managed to leapfrog some of the proneness of modernism and allow the work of art, individual concerns, and social concerns to coexist in the work of art. And that I found in the visual arts, the choice was always being made between social responsibility or individual concerns or aesthetic concerns. And those spheres were treated quite separately. Well, for example, if you think of a Polish writer, Miłosz, where there was no separation really between the quality of the work of art, the social engagement of the work of art, and then the individually felt. So for this reason, writers became models for me of how to be in the world as an artist. And also they sidestep some of the questions that markets and auction houses and things like that sometimes introduced to the concerns of the visual arts. And then my own writings range from these little fragments that look like poems, as if they're a lot worse than poems, and philosophical reflections, essays, and so on. And I just finished my first novel, The Year of the Moth, which I have been working on for quite a long time. So yeah, writing is very important to me.
Well, congratulations on finishing a novel. That's also no small achievement. In your writings, I noticed that you continually seem to come back to like a certain quest for truth, a truth in painting, a truth in writing, a truth in art. Can you talk about this pursuit of truth, and especially now in a world that proliferates in AI imagery and made up news stories and the like, what the significance is, and perhaps what I'm trying to say is the crucial need to search for this truth and what it means to you as you work.
Yeah, this is such an important question. As somebody who has hovered around academia for a long time, and I have my position currently at USC. I teach in the English department. I teach philosophical courses, and I teach in the art department. So the question of truth is a question that is make people in the humanities usually roll their eyes, sort of old-fashioned. And the funny part about it is you go to the natural sciences, and every natural scientist still believe in truth. They think there's something out there to be revealed, to be discovered, and that this is something that can function as a pivot point or a beacon for us in our understanding of the world. Clarity and truth, for me, have always been the aim. Is the reason why I read the texts I did when I was younger, why I painted, why I did physics, why I tried to make the choices I make as a father or as a person in the world. Truth is not easy, and ultimate reality, however we want to think of that, is elusive. And therefore, it requires a lot of self-awareness, a lot of sincere efforts to avoid our cynicism. The 20th century, as Peter Sloterdijk beautifully wrote in the Critique of Cynical Reason, is a century that has made cynicism such an intrinsic part of our experience, our understanding, that we are cynical even when we don't think we're being cynical. Our outlook, our politics, our sense of ourselves. And to a certain extent, that cynicism extends, as you brought up, to the question of what artificial intelligence and the question of consciousness suggest about our position as human beings. So to speak of truth in an environment where cynicism is the water in which we swim, is to court ridicule. And yet I'm always inviting people to argue against it, because most people's argument against truth is are quite trivial. And perhaps more importantly, despite all this cynicism, I remember listening to this quote many years ago. I think it was Dewey who said it, that Americans fight for freedom but long for attachment. And I think in many ways, behind behind most cynics, there's someone desperate for believing on something. And truth is not the same thing as belief, but I think especially now when the question of what we are gets asked or challenged in a different way because of artificial intelligence. What is consciousness? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to make an artwork when, assistants make many artists' artworks? Now AI will make many artworks. What does it mean? What are we doing here? These are questions that are peripheral to the question of truth, but are related to it.
And do you think that, painting itself can be a counter to this pervading cynicism that you're talking about?
So let me answer that question the best way I think I know how. And the first point to make is we can never talk of painting or of art in general terms, because unlike, say, physics, which is very specific, and if I say physics, we all know what I mean. When we say art or painting, there are some paintings that is never going to be a counterpoint to cynicism or to some of the trivialities introduced by artificial intelligence. But some paintings are a counterpoint. Some paintings are alternatives. And the same is true with art. Art is such a, we apply the term art to such different kinds of experiences, and some really, really terrible works are called art. And some magnificent things are called art. So to me, the term art and painting mean absolutely nothing unless somebody accompanies with examples and definitions of what they mean by that. But to take the spirit of your question, what I mean by painting, which is, say, for example, Velázquez or Manet, or perhaps something more recent, like Malevich. It's hard to imagine that I'm going back to the 1920s to talk about something more recent, but there are many other ones more recent, but let's just stick with those. I think that they offer a reckoning to us of what we are, and really ask us to take ourselves seriously, to take our life seriously, and to take the question of if artificial intelligence can, for example, produce something, is it by the fact that it can be produced an example of what art is not? Picasso, in being confronted with photography and being asked, well, now that we have photography, well, what's the role of painting? Picasso's response, well, now we know what painting is not.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually a good argument here for artificial intelligence. I think there's something, and I said this not naively. I have been thinking and reading about this thing, so I feel that there's something about the experience of life, physically, with a body, with the limitations, with knees that you can scrape, with eyes that cry, or hearts that can get rejected, that creates the experience of living, from which then we create writings, art, ideas, letters to friends and family, that AI could imitate. And since most art is a form of imitation of art, in that sense, AI will be just as good as most artists.
Mm-hmm.
But it will not be a replacement for art that comes from living and point towards truth. And even though that's probably a very narrow band of what art is, I think that is safe.
Mhm.
It's safe.
I'm glad you brought up this the experience of life and the physical feeling of being in a body. As I was preparing over the weekend, a word that I kept coming across in relation to your work was longing, and it was something that was repeated across a number of texts, a sense of longing in these paintings, and it made me think of a word my Brazilian friend taught me many years ago, a Portuguese word, saudade, which is sort of like, it doesn't exactly have an English translation, but it's a longing, a deep nostalgia for something you maybe possibly had and no longer do, or even something that you never had and wished you did. And it combines pain and joy. I wonder if you could talk about longing or perhaps saudade in the context of your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think is we come into this world um, in a very abrupt manner. Very birth is a very abrupt thing, and in some ways that abruptness continues on as we live. There's always things around the corner surprising us, and I think most of us, um, in sort of a Jungian sense, are aiming for this sense of individuation and sort of birthing ourselves into a whole rather than just abruptly thrown into the world to find what we are in it. And so I think at the core of the human experience is a certain longing for that unity. And when you account for that for ourselves as part of a reality that for the most part we don't understand, that eludes us, there is a longing implicit in that, a longing that of understand how we belong to something other than ourselves, and even ourselves, which we don't really understand very well. And it's more than understanding, we don't really know very well. So at the core of what it means to be human is some sort of fundamental longing, which is different than nostalgia. I think there's something about nostalgia that that is problematic. And nostalgia is longing for a time that really is doesn't exist and never did exist. Is sort of in the same way that in our world today, we try to imagine that there's an America that was maybe better another time. And this is often weaved by misunderstandings and poor memory of what living actually means. Um, so I think that nostalgia um, is not very interesting to me, although I can see how people might look at my work and imagine that nostalgia is part of it. But longing definitely is. I think that, and not just because I'm an exile, which is sometimes what is said. Sometimes people imagine that because I left my country when I was 7, that somehow that implies a fundamental longing of loss, a loss to some identity or to some sense of belonging. But my concern with the longing that I'm interested in is more fundamental than that. Um, and and part of the reason that I work as an artist is to make a connection, say, make connection with you in this conversation or in the engagement with the work that I put this work into the world, which is my own inquiry into what is true or into what has an offering of clarity for me. And then maybe you make a connection with it. And in that way, I am less alone. And that longing, that sense of, of belonging to a sort of something more fundamental and broader than just my own individual experience gets a little bit more complete by the fact that you and I are having this conversation. And beyond that, the sense that all of, not maybe not all of it, but certainly a lot of the impulse for our work, and certainly mine, is for a revelation of an ultimate reality that dissolves the boundaries between my skin and the world and you, and that somehow there's something bigger, more fundamental, connecting all things, and that art is sometimes an opening to that, and the longing for that opening, for that crack, for that recognition and awareness is very much in my work.
I wonder if we could look at a couple of the installation photos, and you could talk a little bit about some of these connections in relation to the paintings and how they're hung in the show and at the gallery, especially for those who aren't going to be able to see it out in California.
Yeah, so here's two pieces that I purposely put together right at the entrance of the beautiful. The gallery has two spaces, and the show extends over both spaces. And this, you see this immediately upon coming into the main space to your left. And I wanted to sort of have two motions. So when you have an open door that slightly opens and reveals the world outside, the movement is out, is you can feel the line of force of that opening to the wilderness going out. You want to sort of go out there, and that movement is inward. But when you have this deer that by the very act of suggesting that eye that looks at you, forces you to be a witness, and it witnesses you in the act of looking, then the line of force is towards you as opposed to towards the painting. And I wanted to put this movement, you know, into the painting and towards you, next to each other at the entrance of the show, and say, here's the wilderness. The wilderness is just two movements, outwards and inwards. And both of them have a certain promise to them, which I love to see. They're next to each other. I mean, you can see the fragments of the deer, the way the edges suggest that this is a fragment. The deer is what you see in the openings between these two sides. And the same with the tree. It's an opening between these two sides, it's two doors. And both of them point to a world that you can engage, but you cannot fully own. You cannot really, it's always out of reach, and I love seeing those two together. I mean, that was the idea of that installation. And then by looking at it, then you have a sense of what the show will be about. Once you look at this is the show, really.
And then maybe you can turn to slide 12, actually, which shows three, and I really loved this view because this one introduces the painter that we were talking about earlier in relation to the other works.
Yeah, this is the other room, and I love this the juxtaposition with the first gallery, which is very finished and beautifully crafted, and then you have this second one that used to be a stable. Um, I think a long time ago, I forgot what Wendy said, but I don't know, like 100 years ago or something. Um, and it has an unfinished quality that brings out a certain rawness that is very nice to see the work in this context. So the painting to the left, for instance, is a view of Picasso's last studio with the burnt tree inside of it. So it brackets this figure carrying a rose bush, where the root ball is slowly losing dirt, sandwiched between two painters. And I love that these sort of columns in the middle create viewing moments within the installation.
I really am interested in the human figures and then juxtaposed with what is very obviously physical nature, trees or animals. Um, does that reflective of your own perhaps like personal interest in a natural world, or do you see I guess I'm wondering about your connection or what your idea of humanity's connection to a greater natural world.
I am very interested in that idea of our connection. A poet that I like very much, a California poet called Robinson Jeffers, uh, uh, makes a beautiful argument for our just be us being just part of nature as a whole. But in the case of our work, I'm constantly moving between the landscape, the figures, and trees, and so on. And in this body of work, also interiors, which is something I don't do very often. And the strange thing about my view of my work is that they have these images, but the images are not in themselves. Like I'm not like tomorrow I might never paint a tree again or a figure again, or it's unlikely. I probably will do them again because there are elements of the world that I am curious about. My work is always very simple. It has very little culture in it. There are elements from everyday life, but they're not in themselves. I'm not a student of figures or a student of trees. I'm a student is not the right word, right? I'm concerned with states of being. And sometimes those states of being are brought forth by the landscape or by a figure. Figures are problematic because they're always so theatrical. It would relate to the painting through relating to the figure. And I think sometimes this is so anecdotal and sort of superficial. That is whenever I put a figure into my work, the battle is to make sure that the painting remains besides the figure, that there's actually a painting there, not just an actor playing a role that you relate to.
Mm.
So, but yeah, I mean, to complete that thought, like I never know what the next painting will look like because there's no formula to my strategy. And this is why I can never have, this is one of the reasons I can never have an assistant make my work because I wouldn't know what to tell them to make. And the other reason I couldn't have somebody make my work is because everything that we think of making is always a low-hanging fruit.
Mm.
And only through the process of deepening ourselves in relationship with our work is that we can go beyond what is trivial and superficial.
And maybe we can just go before we have to end to slide 11, which I just thought was one other really beautiful pairing of two of these paintings we've been talking about today. And maybe you can say something about about this, the groupings that are evident in both of them.
Yeah, I mean, here we have two couples of sorts, two birds in some sort of mysterious conversation that we don't have access to, and this couple that look almost like figurines walking into an unknown in many ways. They pass the threshold. Thresholds are important in the painting to the left, the one with the birds. There's also a threshold there. Um, and I wanted to sort of, I love the idea of them being one informing and changing the other by their relationship to one another. The painting of the couple here with the baby, I find it very puzzling because there's so little information onto these figures, just few little markings, but I find them to have in their pose, in all of them, so much emotional weight that I was very surprised that it occurred like this. Um, and and in some ways, that same emotional way exists in some ways in impenetrable little birds that seem to be in some sort of exchange that is beyond our reach.
Mm.
So that was the idea of placing these two together.
Enrique, when I was reading this weekend, I was really struck by a quote in one of your writings, which I think I think from quite some time ago now at this point. But you said, "Art, which is many things to many people, is just one thing to me, a whisper of the order of things that dismantles consciousness and suggests my place in the world." Is that something that still rings true for you now? And if so, um, can you talk about it in relation to the wilderness?
Thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah, that is absolutely still true, and it probably will always be true for me. I This whisper that I speak about is that sense of an ultimate reality, which is another way of saying truth. Um, and that dismantling of consciousness. But if I were to add something to that thought today to make it more easier to understand, so I think there's too much biography in our talk about art and in the art we make. And I sometimes want to dismantle that biography to get to something beyond biography, beyond our instances, beyond, even though not to belittle the instances and the life that we have lived, but all those instances point to always to something beyond themselves. And I think that painting has a capacity to bring us to the present and hold us in front of it and make oh, at least for a moment, at least briefly, make all that we say we are just kind of fracture and allow us to be in the presence of something that reorders our understanding. There's a fundamental order of the world that is revealed in glimpses. And I think that's what paintings can do. Often they don't do it, and mine often fail at doing it. But that is that's what makes me come to the studio every day. That's what made me paint and repaint paintings. Sometimes I will work on a painting for 5 years in search for that glimpse. Yeah.
Well, this has been a really enlightening and wonderful conversation. I encourage everybody who's able to go see Enrique's show at Wendi Norris in San Francisco before it closes next weekend. And with that, Enrique, I just want to say thank you for such a beautiful conversation. I'm honored to have participated today, and I'm looking forward to hearing what some of the audience has to ask you.
Jessica, thank you for your thoughtful, well, like I really appreciated the seriousness and the attention that you paid to the work. I'm very grateful for it. It's as I said before, it makes me feel less alone by knowing that you and your insightful mind paid attention to these things. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for the conversation. There is a link in the chat where you can submit questions for Enrique, and we highly encourage everyone to submit as questions. But we have a few questions from the audience. The first question is from an anonymous member in the audience who asked if there are any poems or poets that have had a great influence on you.
Yeah, the list is very, very, very long, but let's just mention a few. The Russian poet Marina Tsvetaeva and Boris Pasternak are two people who certainly in my mid-years were incredibly influential, and they still think of Pasternak constantly. Miguel Hernandez, Thomas Transformer, Robert Frost, Czeslaw Milosz, Robinson Jeffers, and the list goes on. It's a very long list. Sometimes I get surprised who touches me at each moment in time. There are poets that I forget for a very long time, and then one day I show up and grab, like say, for example, Harry Martinson, the Swedish poet, and I will be floored by some passage about an undersea cable. So yeah, poets, we need them, and we need more of them, and we need to support them.
Amazing. Thank you, Enrique. I have two questions for you. One, I wanted to hear a little bit more about your involvement with academia. You've been in multiple different sort of disciplines, and I wanted to hear a little bit about your teaching practice and how that overlaps with your painting practice. And two, I really like the connections that you draw through your practice, the way in which you discussed your edges. I feel like there's this sense of translation or the way in which you position yourself, maybe in the edges of different disciplines between science and arts, but also between writing and art. I was wondering if that also applies to language, the languages that you speak and the languages that you read, assuming that you read in different languages.
So academia, I've benefited tremendously from being an apprentice to a painter, from having great teachers, having mentors who changed my life. And I mean, I think if I ever were to claim any special skill, I think one of my best skills have been to be able to identify mentors and holding on to them. I think that have saved my life in many ways. So I love to try to offer some of that back, and I think one of the most exciting parts for me of teaching is to see the trust that students have, students of any age, on what I have to offer, and I take that trust very seriously. And currently I teach in literature, which is always very funny when I walk into a classroom with an accent and I tell them I'm going to teach them English. So, and I'm interested in philosophy, and I teach that, and then art and critical theory, and all of them are different, and they serve both me and the students in different ways. And in terms of the idea of edges, I think we all exist in an edge, in some sort of liminal in-between space, in aspects of our lives, sometimes in significant parts of our lives. And in the edges of my paintings, one of the things I didn't mention before is the question of authenticity of a work of art is deeply connected to that idea of how the edge of the work is considered. And I don't want to go into it now, but it's a worthwhile topic to understand whether any conversation of authenticity must always answer, well, what is a painting, which is a fundamental concern for me in the studio. What is a painting? And the answer to what is a painting is connected to the edges. And of course, the edges point, as you suggest in the question, with the idea of the limits of where we are. I think most of us like to think of where we are as the center of something. I am a Latin person, or I am this, and we think of the center of that, the bulk of that. But truly, what most defined us, how you can learn the most about me and I can learn the most about you, is in the edges of those definitions. What kind of Latin person are you really? What is that edge in there? How is it different than being, say, from New England? Where's that edge? And in trying to understand that edge, I think there's a lot of revelation about what really matters to you, because in some ways, being Latin or Cuban with many, many people have nothing to do with. But when I try to say, well, how am I not from New England, which I love, and I try to explain that, something gets revealed in that edge. That fringe tells me a lot about the center.
You sound so much. The next anonymous question, I think, transitions well from the answer that you just gave. And they're curious when you know a painting is done. Is it once you've reached the feeling that you mentioned towards the end of the conversation?
So this is always an important question, not always an easy one to answer in words. A painting is done when it is separate from me, when it has an autonomy, when it resonates separate from my intentions. As long as the painting is subordinated to what I wanted to do, the lessons I wanted to do, the plans that I have, the image that I was seeking, as long as it's that, it's never finished, because it's kind of like a baby. He hasn't become an adult yet, with his own demands and his own destiny. When a painting gains its own destiny and its own autonomy, it becomes something else separate from me. I don't control it anymore, and then I know it's done, and I send it into the world. Sometimes it sounds like really hard to tell, and in trying to find analogies, I will use the analogy that when you encounter someone and I ask you, well, how do you know this person is authentic or they're just a pretender? And you know the experience. You have been in front of someone that you know to be the real thing and someone who is not. But if I ask you to articulate that, you will have a hard time. Give me a list of attributes. And yet the experience of being in front of such a person is very clear to you. We all get confused, of course, but for the most part, it's clear. The same is true with the painting. When a painting is not real, you know that it's not real if you are open to it and you give up all the things you wanted it to be. You give up whatever egos you have of your intentions and your plans and your shows. None of that ultimately matters to the painting. The painting is its own purpose, separate from your intentions. And to the extent that your goals and intentions and plans and theories overarch over the painting like a limit, like some sort of persona, some sort of shell, the painting will never be finished, even when you think it is finished.
Thank you, Enrique. We have another anonymous question. Could Enrique discuss the idea of narrative in painting versus pictorial or subject-oriented painting? Thank you.
Paintings are, even though there's a lot of narrative paintings, and some people might describe my paintings as narrative. I don't describe my paintings as narrative. I think they're fragments of narrative, and the smaller the narrative, the truer the painting can be a painting. I think there's a lot of things that paintings are not good at doing. Painting is a timeless artwork, and because paintings are timeless, time is not part of paintings. Narrative and paintings are always in collision to each other. So that doesn't mean that you cannot attempt to deal with that collision. If you're a serious painter, then you're going to take on that collision of the time suggested in the narrative and the timeless quality of painting, and you will take that as the problem, as opposed to something you ignore and you pretend it's not there, which is sometimes how people approach painting. So that being said, to try to insert a narrative on painting tends to take painting out of the authentic experience it can be in itself, and lays next to the painting another experience that is like a satellite experience to the experience of painting. And although I love, for example, The Last Crucifixion by Titian as a great narrative painting, or I can imagine sort of Goya's the May the 3rd as a narrative painting, and I can appreciate those paintings, or Leonardo, the Virgin of the Rocks, as a narrative painting. But the power of those paintings, in my opinion, emerges despite the narrative. The narrative is a means to locate you in an emotional place, but the paintings are functioning and working and doing their thing by something other than the narrative. And an example of that is by just looking, for example, at Two Madonnas by Giotto and say Cimabue, and you look at both of those paintings, and almost everything is decided by the church, but what you get from them is different. And that you get from them is the heart of painting. So I think that painting and storytelling are in a collision course quite often with each other. But a great painter can deal with that as a problem and then do something amazing with it. But the painter that just, quote unquote, uses narrative is likely to create paintings that are less less revealing than they can otherwise be if they were to work with the problem of narrative. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Enrique. And our last question is from Bong. Allen Ginsberg once said of Francesco Clement being a Blakean painter, partly for the fluidity of how his images can be fluidly generated. I wonder what or how magic magical realism, be it Marquez or Leo Carpentier, etc., has had any impact on the flow of your images?
So even though I loved say Garcia Marquez work, and I have like a masterpiece of a book like Cien Años de Soledad, or Alejo Carpentier, of course, a masterful and Cuban writer. I don't think of my work in the realm of magical realism. There is something in my work that may look at times surrealistic, at times um, appealing to some sort of magical thing or something, but it's not at all anything I think about. I'm interested in fragments, and so the kind of people that really most influenced my thinking in this way have been sort of very Nordic, Scandinavian writers more than anything. But part of the problem I have now at my age of 60 with some of the magical realist writers, and maybe I have become too dried up and too not fun enough. But I think one of my problems is that there's too much whimsy, too much surprise, too much flourish. And even though I understand how those things can reveal, like the image of a giant block of ice in the middle of a tropical rainforest is such an absurd image. I am not so interested in absurdity. I'm not so interested in surprise. I'm not so interested in anything that is kind of whimsical. I am interested in something that sits in a visceral sense in your stomach and cracks it open, rather than sits in your head and kind of surprises you and give you a little intellectual or emotional candy. I am less interested in cleverness or any kind of surprise that is delightful, that I am in a confrontation that sort of strips away what you think your world is to show you something more resonant and deeper underneath. And that to me doesn't happen with any cleverness, intelligence that sometimes I find in some magical realist writings. And I apologize if I'm insulting anyone who loves it. And by the way, as somebody who loves many of these works, I think that there's a humility, a surrender of one's weapons, a kind of demand of oneself to not be interesting, to not be fancy, to not surprise, to not be clever, that then allows for the possibility of something like a Fra Angelico painting to occur.
Wonderful. Thank you, Enrique. While I start sharing the poem that you wanted to share at the end, do you want to give a brief introduction?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that in this opportunity that we're all here together, and at this moment in our history, which I think is a very, very specific moment in our history, I thought that I would take the beautiful words of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a writer that, I mean, it's maybe a writer for many times other than ours, but perhaps now is a good moment to bring this reminder. In the Gulag Archipelago, he writes, Gradually, it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. This line shifts inside us, it oscillates with the years, and even with hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts, there remains an uprooted small corner of evil. And the reason that this is so important for us to remember is because it's very easy to point our finger to all the things that are happening in our world that we do not like. But I try to remind myself, and I will, in a small way, very modestly ask you to remember that that line between good and evil is going through your heart as well. And that now, at this moment in history, nothing is accidental. And things quite often in history are what they are for reasons that we can point to. And I would like to suggest, let's start with the reason of what sits in our hearts and that line between us. And we all can do better.
Thank you so much, Enrique, and thank you, Jess, for such thoughtful questions. Thank you, Daniel, Vioma, and Diana for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Odile Donald Odita and Dan Cameron on the occasion of Odile Donald Odita Songs from Life at the Museum of Modern Art. And as it is a Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was such a thank you.
That was great.
Such a great
Thank you.
conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank
man.
you, Jessica.
Thank
you. Thank you, Jess. Thank
Congratulations,
you, Enrique.
Enrique.
Buddy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Enrique.
Thank you, Enrique.
Always good.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Goodbye,
Thank you,
everybody.
Jessica.
Thank you, Fong. Good to see you. Bye, everybody.
Bye bye.
Go see the show, everybody.